Yeah.
This is Geek Therapy Radio.
What are we waiting for?
And now your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio, and I kind of want to just jump right into it, so I'm going to do the plugs real quick, because I don't think, now that I'm at my new time here at 10 p.m. On KPRC 950, the 950. Remember when it was called Radio Mojo? Pepperidge Farm remembers. Anyway, since I've been on this new time slot at 10 p.m. Saturday nights, I don't think I've plugged the fact that this is a podcast as well. It's 2019, and being on AM radio is cool, and it's very romantic in its way. And me being a geek, it's not lost on me that these electromagnetic waves beam through the universe all across the galaxy in a way that podcasts can't. So theoretically, it could be on a star 4.5 light years away, and 4.5 years later, they could tune into this episode of Geek Therapy Radio. That's kind of, I'll get into the plugs in a second. You know what the plugs are anyways. That's podcast and YouTube, but I'll get to that in a second. It's kind of geeky to think about that. If I can stay on the air just long enough, if I can stay on the air for at least 4.5 years, I've been on the air for about 2 years now, almost exactly 2 years now, which in itself is a miracle. Actually, my numbers are pretty good. Podcast numbers, and it keeps growing. So I have you to thank for that. But if I can stay on the air for just 4.5 years, that means if there's any life on any planets around Proxima Centauri, which is 4.22 or 4.3, whatever light years away, it's our closest neighboring star other than our sun, because remember, our sun is a star. Our closest neighboring star, if there's intelligent life around it, and they have radios, which physics is the same everywhere in the universe, so why wouldn't they have some sort of radio? And if they could tune into just the right frequency, if they can tune into 950 kilohertz on the AM band on their planet, that means, theoretically, with a lot of signal boosting, they could tune into Geek Therapy Radio. So that's my goal. Stay on the air, keep a show for 4.5 years so that the aliens can tune into episode 1 of Geek Therapy Radio. So yes, Geek Therapy Radio, you're listening to it on the broadcast. It's also a podcast. Make sure you're subscribed to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. It's super duper easy on iTunes or that podcast app on your iPad or your iPhone. Just type in Geek Therapy Radio podcast. Make sure it's with Johnny Hamburger. There's another Geek Therapy network. That is not me. That's not me. And I have this theory that I've probably been sending them a lot of subscribers through the years just because we have such a similar name. I am not the Geek Therapy Network. I am Geek Therapy Radio with Johnny Hamburger. So search Geek Therapy Radio podcast in your favorite podcast player, like I just mentioned, iTunes, the podcast app on your iPad or iPhone. I love Pocket Casts on my Android device. I have a Samsung Galaxy Note 9. And I use an app called Pocket Casts, and it is a wonderful, wonderful app. Of course, Spreaker. And the best app of all, best for last, and I'm kind of saving my bacon here, the iHeartRadio app. Subscribe to Geek Therapy Radio on the iHeartRadio app. On the iHeartRadio app, you can listen to Geek Therapy Radio live as it airs, 10 p.m. Saturday night Central Time. But in case you missed that, in case you forget to tell your Uber while you're riding around to tune into Geek Therapy Radio on KPRC, you can use the same iHeartRadio app to subscribe to my podcast, Geek Therapy Radio Podcast, and all the other awesome podcasts here on KPRC 950. I'm really happy that I'm on KPRC 950 because sometimes, I called the show Geek Therapy Radio, it's an oasis in the sea of politics. I am surrounded by political talk shows. That's no mystery there. Shows that tend to deal with more politics than I do, and I very much pride myself on not talking about a whole lot of politics, even though I can get saucy sometimes, and I certainly have my political opinions and my political views. Don't you worry about that. If I ever filled in on, the Jesse Kelly show, which I was on earlier this week. If I ever filled in on Jesse Kelly's show or for Charles Adams' Big Angry, I would delve into more politics because that's the proper avenue for it. But Geek Therapy Radio is not. Whether you're Republican or Democrat, we all love Star Wars. We all love Star Trek. We all think jet fighter airplanes are cool. Trains are cool. Remote control cars are cool. Cars are cool. We'll talk about cars here in the next segment, actually. I kind of have some interesting ideas about the future of collector cars, and that cars you might not think are collector cars will probably be collector cars in the relatively near future, but we'll talk about in the next segment. So anyways, I'm surrounded by political shows. Geek Therapy Radio is not political, and I'm happy I'm on KPRC because as I think about it, as I sat down and actually thought about it, KPRC is, and I've pitched it this way a few times to the higher ups. KPRC is it's like your podcast list, but on the actual AM radio. And what I mean by that is there are such a variety of shows on KPRC. And that is one thing I'm very thankful for, to be a part of the KPRC family. You have Outlaw Dave, who precedes me, talking about bikes and bars and babes and stuff. I don't really talk about the babes. That's not kind of what my show is. But I'm just saying that if that's your thing, if that's what you're into, the whole biker culture, I myself had a couple motorcycles. Outlaw Dave comes on right before me. That's a really different, cool show. Pursuit of Happiness with Ken Webster Jr. What's on Tap Radio with James Simpson. That's a show about beer. That's a show about beer. He gets to talk about beer. And he's on in the afternoon, Sunday afternoons. I think, here's my pitch. I'm pitching it to you listeners right now. So you can send emails to Justin King, who's the assistant program director of KPRC. I think that the Saturday or Sunday lineup should be local Houston talk radio. So it should be Black Coffee Radio with Greg Lavaldi and Justin King, who I just mentioned. Black Coffee Radio. And then Geek Therapy Radio with me. And then What's on Tap Radio with James Simpson. Or whatever order, whatever kind of shows, but all the kind of non-political shows that just feature local Houstonians. That's the main focus of this, that it's local, born and raised, born and bred, local Houstonians from our city, from our town, with radio shows back to back, all leading up to Outlaw Dave to end at 10 p.m. on a Sunday night or Saturday night. Either or. I think that's a good idea, but what do you think? You can email me, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com, and go subscribe on YouTube, Geek Therapy Radio on YouTube. You know what? We'll be back in just a little moment. Let's talk about cars in the next segment. And because I'm dense, I just realized that the broadcast date of today's show, even at the risk of keeping these things evergreen, this episode is airing on 4/20. I wonder how that's going to affect my ratings. If people blaze a spliff, like, oh man, let's turn on AM radio. Just like my grandpa used to listen. Let's get ripped and just listen to AM radio. And then they tune into Geek Therapy Radio, and I'm talking about my show broadcasting through the universe to the closest neighboring star to our solar system and intelligent beings listening to the radio. So for all of you who are listening right now, who are, under the influence of medicinal or otherwise, hi. I'm talking to you from another planet. You are listening to Bleep Blorp Radio, and you are flying, bro. You are just soaring through the universe on the back of a turtle with laser beams coming out of its eyes. You are tripping. You found Geek Therapy Radio, and since it's the day that it is, I just realized, welcome into all my trippers. My trippers or otherwise. I said, I'm Johnny Hamburger, your mental curator. Welcome into Geek Therapy Radio. I'm joking, of course. I Should I talk about it? It's kind of politics. I am going to talk about cars. I promise to God this Easter weekend. I'm talking about cars in this segment, but marijuana, should I talk about my thoughts on it? Because I think that might get political. I'm gonna hold off on that. I'll just say that I'm pretty. People can do whatever the heck they want. Let's talk about cars. In that specifically, there are cars. I think that there's a lot of cars right now that are driving around that we don't really think about. They're 90s vehicles, early 2000s vehicles, whatever, even kind of modern vehicles driving around that we can't ever see becoming classic vehicles. My wife drives a 2015 Volkswagen Jetta. It is a wonderful car. I come from a long lineage of Volkswagen drivers in my family. I always drive a Volkswagen. Right now, my car is an Audi, but that is a Volkswagen technically. It's all Volkswagen parts. So I have nothing against Volkswagen, but I can't imagine that a 2015 Jetta will ever be a future classic car. I grant you that. I know that you were thinking that. Like, what do you mean modern cars? Like a modern Honda Civic is going to be a future classic? No, not necessarily. But cars that are even slightly unique right now, or going back to when millennials were in high school or anything like that. Cars that are even remotely unique from our generation, let me just use anecdotal. Let's say I am in high school. It's 2002. I'm a senior in high school. What car was hot in 2002? What was all the rage in Kingwood in 2002? And I already tell you it's a Mustang. Because it was the Kingwood Mustangs. That was our mascot for the high school. So every other car in the parking lot was a Kingwood Mustang. And I grew to resent Mustangs. I could not, car geeks, I'm going to apologize right now. I could not see the appeal of the Ford Mustang. I respected its history. I respected the pony car for what it was. I didn't hate the Mustang for what it was, but I despised the familiarity with it, and I despised the monotony and the dime a dozen nature of the Ford Mustang, especially in the early 2000s. It's only recently that I think the Ford Mustang has gotten desirable to me, that I wouldn't mind driving a Ford Mustang or looking at one, because they look really good now. Do not get me wrong. Like modern Mustangs, look at a 2018 Mustang. They look really good compared to how they looked even just a few years ago. I'd say late 2010s-ish is when for the Ford Mustang started looking really good. You know why that is? Aston Martin. Have you noticed in Ford Fusion, front end of Ford Fusion looks like an Aston Martin DB9 or DB7 or Vanquish. Since Ford and Aston Martin got in bed together, Mustangs and other Ford vehicles take on a lot of resemblance from Aston Martins, and Aston Martins are some of the most undeniably, undisputably, inarguably, okay, everything's arguable, some of the most beautiful cars in the world. And they've been like that for a long time. Aston Martins will always be collectible to a certain degree. So I'm not talking about the Ford Mustang in general, because I just think there's too many of them. Yes, if you have a Shelby like a GT350 or GT500, a Cobra 500, a Saleen, something like that. Yes, in the future that will be a collectible. And I'm getting somewhere with this. Just bear with me for a second. But let's talk about the more mundane cars of the early 2000s, cars you might not have even thought about. I'll use this as an example. Oh, what year was it? What year's model? 1997 or 98? Car geeks, let me know. Email me, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. Better yet, Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook. Light me up there what you think about this. Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook or Twitter. Geek Therapy Radio. I think it was the 1997. Don't quote me on that directly. 1997 Acura Integra Type R. Now, back when I was in high school, yes, that was it was a hot hatchback. And that's just the name for hatchbacks, hot hatchbacks. Like a GTI, Volkswagen GTI is a hot hatchback. It's just a fast hatchback, like a performance version of a typical hatchback. So the Acura Integra Type R. front-wheel drive, front engine. At the time, I didn't think much of it, and I still don't. That car isn't necessarily my cup of tea. But it just sold an auction, a low mileage version of it, about 1,100 miles, a Hewlett Packard. That's not the auction. But a recent auction, that's a computer company, a dead one. At a recent auction, an Acura Integra Type R, I think it's 1997, sold for $63,000. Can most of you listeners right now who aren't car people, can you picture an Acura Integra Type R? You'd think that you can't, but I guarantee you've seen them a lot over the past 20 years. You've seen them everywhere. There's nothing remarkable looking about them. Nothing. Car people know what they are. Like the average car person, for instance, the average non-car person would see a Subaru WRX driving around, not think anything of it. But a car person knows that's actually a pretty special car. That's a nice, rally car. It's not very good looking. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. But we appreciate that car. The Subaru BRZ, Toyota FRS, Scion FRS, and Toyota GT86. It's all the same car. Most non-car people would see that car, not think anything of it. Car people would see that car and say, that's a really neat car. Front engine, rear-wheel drive, low center of gravity. Cheap and affordable rear-wheel drive front engine car. That's a special car. So the Acura Integra doesn't look very special. It would blend in with anything else on the road. Yet recently on auction in 1997, just bland late 90s car got $63,000. Do you know why? Because the person who was in high school in 1997 when the Acura Integra Type R came out really wanted the Acura Integra Type R, but it was just a broke high school student. Now that high school student's grown up, has money, wants the car of his or her dreams from when they were in high school. So think about right now, kind of modern era. If you're 18 years old, maybe I have some listeners that young listening. What's the hotness now? What car is the hotness now? It's that car that will be, or has a very good chance of being, a future classic. So I'm going to talk about future classics in the next segment. We'll get into this more, that to look out for. Because it's very interesting. It's stuff that you wouldn't think about, but I'll explain why they're going to be future classics coming up in the next segment of Geek Therapy Radio in segment 3. Let's talk about that. In the meantime, go subscribe to Geek Therapy Radio on YouTube. Go follow and like and subscribe, all the good stuff. Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that good stuff. We'll be right back with more Geek Therapy Radio. Let's keep talking about cars and a few modern classics. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and I was right about the 1997 Acura Integra Type R. It was, in fact, a 1997 Acura Integra Type R, and it did sell for $63,000, which is amazing. So, as I was saying in the past segment, if you're just joining Geek Therapy Radio, we're talking about cars that you might think are kind of mundane now that could be future classics. And in this segment, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but also specifically why they are going to be future classics. And the answer might surprise you. Can you do clickbait on the radio? Listen bait? Ear bait? So I'll just use this as an example. There recently, by recently, I mean maybe last year, I was talking to Matt Farah from the Smoking Tire. Some of you might know who Matt Farah is. He's got a YouTube channel. He's a automotive writer, Motor Trend, all that good stuff. He's very prolific in the car industry. Almost every car person knows who Matt Farah is, and I had him on the show. I've had him on the show a couple times, but the first time I had him on the show, which is why you should subscribe to Geek Therapy Radio podcast, because I meticulously title and describe each of these shows. So if you subscribe to Geek Therapy Radio podcast, you can look through the entire backlog and find the Matt Farah episodes and listen to our conversations. So one of the things I asked him last year was about Toyota MR2 Spyders. And we talked about Toyota MR2s and the DeLorean in that episode. And I know that the DeLorean is it appreciates. It is a classic car that just gets more and more valuable every day. I have a DeLorean. I know that it's a classic. I know it appreciates in value and will continue to appreciate in value. That's a given. A DeLorean's a classic car. That is just a flat out given. But the Toyota MR2 from the 80s, 90s, and their last version 3 of it in the early 2000s, I own a 2000 Toyota MR2 Spyder. Spyder just means convertible. That's for the Gen 3 of MR2. That's the only way they came. You can buy a hardtop for it, but really it's a convertible. You can buy a shell that you put over the convertible top. Anyways, I was talking to him about classic MR2s, and the only MR2 right now that most people agree is a collector car are the 80s MR2s. The 90s MR2s, yes, especially if it's a turbo, that's becoming a collector car. The 80s MR2s are more so becoming collector cars because they are unique. The MR2s were basically touted as the poor man's Ferrari. The way the MR2 has always been set up from day one is mid-engined, rear-wheel drive, just like a Ferrari. With a Ferrari and Lamborghini, most of the models, they have the engine behind the driver, but in front of the rear axle, making it a rear engine, or making it a mid-engined car. The engine is in the middle is behind the driver, but in between the two axles, and that dramatically changes the handling characteristics of a car. It's a very, very desirable setup. Almost every like Grand Prix cars, F1, Formula 1 cars, Formula cars, Formula 1, 2, 3, whatever, they're all mid-engined. Le Mans, for the most part, all mid-engine. Most race cars are mid-engine because they have the most dynamic handling abilities, characteristics. So the fact that Toyota, a very accessible auto manufacturer, made a very, very cheap and reliable, because the engines in the Toyota MR2s were just the same engines that were in Corollas and whatnot. They're just mid-engine setup, that you could buy these things for super cheap and get the exact same handling characteristics, outside of like acceleration, of course, as a $300,000 Ferrari, but in a car that costs $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 for the common man with Toyota reliability. That is thumbs up all across the board. And I will say right now that my 2000 MR2, she's a little banged up. The bodywork's not great. She burns oil. She falls victim to the catalytic issue that the early MR2 Spyders, pre-2003 or 4 Spyders, fall victim to. Mine is falling victim to that. I don't care. I got to put some extra oil in it once in a while. That's fine with me. I spent used motorcycle money on it. Seriously, did not spend that much money on it. Less than $4,000 I spent on that car. And I'm telling you right now, I own 3 vehicles. I told you I own the Audi. It's a 2010 S5. It's one of the last small block V8s available in normal, German coupes. The most recent S5s are 3.3 liter 6-cylinder turbos, or supercharged, sorry. But mine is a 2010, which is one of the last 4.2 V8s. 6-speed manual as God intended. Anyways, so I've got that. I've got the DeLorean, which I drive sparingly. I don't put a lot of miles on the DeLorean. The DeLorean is rear engine. The engine in the DeLorean is behind the rear axle. And then I have the MR2, which I bought for basically chump change when it comes to cars. That 2000 Toyota MR2 Spyder is penny for penny, dollar for dollar, the best car I have ever bought in my life. And dollar for dollar, penny for penny, ounce for ounce, it is the best car I've ever driven, period, ever. For the money. And even for a lot more money than it cost. having the mid-engine in a nice peppy, it's only 138 horsepower, whatever. That's all you need. The car weighs something like 1,800 pounds. It's less than a ton, I believe, in that car. It's a very, very lightweight car with the wheels all the way to each corner on the outside, and the engine in the middle. That thing, it has the best road feel, the best steering dynamics. It is such a hoot to drive, and I know a lot of people put turbos, or if they do engine swaps, a 2ZZ engine swap in there, get 200 horsepower. I have no desire to do that. Well, I should rephrase that. Yeah, I have a desire to do that, but I have no itch to actually get it done, because it's such a hoot, even with 130 horsepower. Such a hoot. I can do things in it at legal, within the speed limit that you can't do until you're going 150 in a Ferrari. Throwing it sideways, hey, I'm not going to incriminate myself too much here, but like, you can go around a left turn. Let's say there's nobody on the streets, no one around. You can go take a left through an intersection. You get that tail out, buddy. You're going 25, 30 miles an hour, and you're going sideways through an intersection. Now, that is illegal, and I don't necessarily go just completely sideways, but it's easy just to flick that tail out, going the legal speed limit, going under the speed limit. You can't do that in a Ferrari. The Ferrari sticks. The Lambo sticks. By the time you get the tail out in a Ferrari, you're doing 100 miles an hour. You need a racetrack for that. I'm saying in the MR2 Spider with even 140 horsepower, you're doing that under 30 miles an hour. It's an absolute blast. It is the pinnacle of smiles per gallon. I love that Spider. I'm saying all of that to say this. I think, despite the conversation I had with Matt Farah, I know he's the professional, he's the car guru, basically. He said that he didn't think that the MR2 Spider would ever be a classic, that would ever appreciate in value. And I take his words as wisdom. He knows what he's talking about with cars more than I do, for sure. But I think maybe, I can't speak for him, but I still, even if I'm just being stubborn, I don't care if the car ever appreciates. It's certainly not going to depreciate anymore, which is a good spot to be in for a car to appreciate. I think that the MR2 Spider stands a good chance of being a future classic. And if I held on to it for long enough, it would appreciate in value. And it's not just my MR2 Spider. There are other models of vehicles that I believe will appreciate, and I'm not alone in this. Haggerty has recently put out an article describing the next generation of classic cars, and it basically, well, I'll get into why it is, but some of the cars include early 2000s, late 90s Porsche Boxster. Porsche Boxster was kind of, when it came out, it has a sordid history, the Porsche Boxster does. It's a baby 911, not truly a 911. It's mid-engine. It's not rear engine like a 911. But the Porsche Boxster got a lot of crap. But there's other models of cars that you might not necessarily think about being future classics that will be future classics. I think they might kind of surprise you. I think this whole concept is going to surprise you. In the last segment of Geek Therapy Radio here, I'm going to tell you exactly why a lot of cars you don't think will be future classics will be future classics. It's a very fascinating concept to think about. This is all so interesting. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Subscribe to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. In this episode of Geek Therapy Radio, the museum we're looking around, the exhibits we're looking at are future classic cars and how some of them aren't what you might expect them to be. I know when a lot of us think about classic cars, we're thinking, 1959 Corvette, 1969 Charger, Dodge Charger, something like that. We have a picture in our mind of what classic cars are. It's hard for us to imagine any car from recent history becoming a future classic, but that is exactly what happens, what is going to happen, and there's a few cars that will surprise you in how industry experts think they're going to appreciate, think they're going to become future classics. Like I was talking about in the last segment, 1997 through 2004 Porsche Boxster. Porsche Boxster has a very sordid history, gotten made fun of a lot, had a couple of known issues that actually turn out to be very easy to rectify and fix. If you see a Porsche Boxster right now for cheap enough, don't be afraid, and you have the money, don't be afraid to buy it. You can get one for an absolute just steal. Right now, they're valued between like $13,000 and $17,000. Very recently, they were very below $10,000. So they are starting to go up now. So if you find one for a steal, under 10 grand, I would suggest you buy it, fix whatever issue is, happening with it, and then drive it, enjoy it occasionally as a weekend car, and it should appreciate. Don't take this as actual, gospel buying advice. There's a good chance that you could buy something and it just craps out, or you wreck it, or something like that. But these are just what industry analysts think are going to start appreciating. The 1984 through 1993 Saleen Mustang, that doesn't really surprise me. Any sort of specialty, special version of a car that's a contender to be a future classic. The 1996 Corvette, particularly the Grand Sport, but late 90s. Would you ever thought a late 90s Corvette would be a future classic? If you would have told me that, a little while ago, I would have never believed you. 90s Corvettes? What? They suck. Nope. Future classics. They are, what are they valued at now? Yep. When they were brand new in the 90s, $37,000. Right now, they're valued between $36,000 and $50,000. A 90s Corvette. But that's a Corvette, that's a Mustang, that's a Porsche. What you might not be thinking of, more mundane cars, 2004, 2007 Subaru Impreza WRX STI. Just a Subaru. A Subi. A Subaru? A future classic? Yes, actually. 1985 through 89 Toyota MR2. We talked about that a little bit. 2004 to 2006 Dodge Ram. Now, this, of course, is the SRT-10. That's a 10-cylinder engine. It's the same engine as a Viper. You can see why that is appreciating. Here's one that you might not think. 1980 through 1986 Ford Bronco. There's a Ford Bronco in our parking lot. One of our engineers drives it, and you would not look at an old 80s Bronco for most people and think, oh, that's a future classic car. And it just looks like an 80s Ford. It doesn't look like anything special. It looks like an old heap, to most people. An old dinosaur of a car. Nope. Future classic. Ford Broncos are actually quite the rage right now with car enthusiasts. Personally, I don't care. Personally, it's just a Ford Bronco to me. Personally, it's just what O.J. Simpson flew through L.A. in the back of in 1993. That's what I think of when I think of Ford Bronco, but that's also why Ford Broncos, it's part of the allure. That's part of the history of the Ford Bronco it's the OJ trial. So, a Buick, 1994 Buick Roadmaster station wagon with the fake wood side paneling? Are you kidding me? What? Okay. Yeah, okay. It's valued between $13,000 and $18,000 right now. Oh my gosh. Almost 20 grand for a mid-90s fake wood-paneled station wagon. Would you ever have thought? So that's what I'm getting to. With all of this, I'll use the last 5 minutes here to explain myself. The age of the electric car is upon us. It has been upon us for the past even several years, but by the mid-2020s, by 2025, That's the no going back tip of the iceberg. Now, I'm not going to say by 2025 all the cars on the road are going to be electric vehicles. No, that's not what I'm saying. But by 2025, that is going to be the tipping point for the beginning of the true onslaught of electric transportation. That's when it starts. That's when people look back. They say, oh, well, we're dabbling around with it from, the late 90s through, early 2010s. But 2025, that's when all the major auto manufacturers, not just Tesla, not just the small auto manufacturers, that's when Volkswagen and Audi and BMW and Mercedes and Ford and Chevy and all of the big ones, all of the big shot car companies start pumping out electric cars in earnest. It is the dawn, the new age of transportation. Starts in a few years. By 2025, before 2030, that marks the end. That marks the beginning of the end, if it hasn't already, for the internal combustion engine. So what's going to happen at that time? Once the electric cars start being ushered in earnest, in mass, people are going to be looking back at at their old cars. And what old cars are they going to want to save? I go back to my wife's 2015 Jetta. Wonderful car. Is that going to be one of the cars people look back on in 2025, 2030, 2035, 2040, 2050 and think, I would really, you know what? We should have saved. We should have. The 2015 Jetta, that's a classic, baby. No. But what do you think might be? It's going to be the interesting cars. It's going to be the iconic cars. It's going to be any car with some sort of fond attachment, some sort of cultural impact at all. For instance, I would say the Ford, what am I blanking out on? The cop car. I am feeling like an idiot. Let me pause it real quick. The freaking Crown Victoria. You can stop pulling your hair out now. The Crown Victoria, that was iconic as a police car. I honestly think my Toyota MR2 Spider is going to be a collectible one year because it's a mid-engined internal combustion engine that was accessible to the people. I think it's not going to be a classic like a Ferrari is going to be a classic. But what cars do you have? What car did you not give much thought about when you were in high school or in college or something like that? That looking back on it, yeah, that could actually be kind of a unique vehicle in a way. If it's even remotely unique now, if it has even a remote amount of cultural appeal right now, once we usher in the electric cars, those cars with those old internal combustion engine cars with that even certain amount of je ne sais quoi or appeal, those are the ones that will be the future classics. And that's not so far-fetched to say. I'm trying to think of other cars. What's a car right now that you can get in 2018, 19 that's going to be a future classic? I can't think of anything right off the top of my head, even though there will be. Any of the last kind of generation, naturally, not necessarily naturally aspirated, but non-hybrid, non-electrified supercars. I think the Audi R8. The old Audi R8s, quote-unquote, old, 2009, 2010, those are going to be future classics. I have no doubt in my mind that the first generation of Audi R8 is going to be a future classic. Absolutely. It's going to be one of those that are saved from the crusher once all the electric cars descend upon us. So, look in your garage. Look in your driveway. Do you think that might be worth keeping after the electric cars get here? Let me know. Show me what you got. Send me a picture. Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook, Geek Therapy Radio on Instagram and Twitter, all that good stuff. Subscribe to Geek Therapy Radio on YouTube and subscribe to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. Be good to each other. Embrace your geek thing, and I'll see you in the next episode of Geek Therapy Radio.